This is Demetria Spinrad.
And this is Isaac Meyer.
And you're listening to Criminal Records Podcast, a podcast about some of the weirdest cases in true crime history. And I am very excited about this one because I've heard this is going to be an obscenity trial, and you know how I love obscenity trials.
Yes, today we are back on our bullshit talking about the history of obscenity law in the U.S., working back from some past episodes to earlier cases in American history, and combining, of course, what I think are Demetria's two great loves in life, which are obscenity and literature, because today we are talking about the trial of the great literary work Ulysses.
Ulysses? But I heard that was a work of enduring literature, and surely the canon of classic literature doesn't have any dirty bits in it.
Well, it turns out, we should talk about, we can find a way to shoehorn the Canterbury Tales in sometime, right? And just read the Miller's Tale on air.
I'm not actually sure if I guess I could go looking and see if those were actually the subject of any actual obscenity trials. What they're best known for censorship wise is a Victorian guy deliberately choosing to censor them.
I mean,
he's actually he's so famous he even got a particular word for taking the dirty bits named after him, boulderization.
I just want you to have to explain how the fart jokes are really representative of the Pentecost on air so that people can hear you. But we're not talking about medieval literature. We are talking, of course, about Ulysses, one of the great works of modern literary history, penned by the celebrated James Joyce, an author who, and I have to say this just off the bat, I find utterly interminable and just, so annoying to read. If you are a fan of modern literature or James Joyce or Ulysses as a book, we're going to go from the perspective that James Joyce should be allowed to write whatever weird shit he wants to. But if you're looking for me to say nice things about this book, it's not going to happen. And actually, I think, it is interesting that when we talk about Joyce, the thing he is best known for is that two of his books, Ulysses and especially Finnegan's Wake, which we're not going to talk as much about, are basically known just as punchlines, as books that nobody reads because they're so fucking annoying to read. There's a reason for that, is what I'm going to start with.
Yeah, I must admit, my knowledge of modernism is actually not that comprehensive. As you could probably guess from the fact that I love myself a medieval tale. There was a lot of experimentation with form and function and subject matter and the way stories were told and who was the protagonist and how that protagonist's sort of internal life makes it onto the page going on in James Joyce's particular era, and it very much informed a lot of what we still would consider really good storytelling today.
You're making this sound way more interesting than it actually is.
A lot of spaghetti got thrown at the literary wall, and I particularly don't like some of what.
Most of it's on the floor for a good reason. All right, so James Joyce, we got to talk about him quickly. So Joyce is born in Dublin. He is Irish. In 1882, he's from the middle class. Starts off as a teacher and starts writing around the time of World War I. And will actually flee Ireland at the start of World War I because it's still a British colony at this point to avoid the draft. While he's in Zurich, living in Switzerland, he will write Ulysses over the course of the 1910s and finish it in 1921, though it will be serialized before that point, which is actually most of what we're going to be talking about today. After Ulysses, he then starts work on Finnegan's Wake. It takes him 18 fucking years to write Finnegan's Wake. It comes out in 1939, and is famously considered to be one of the most impossible to read works in the history of literature. I want to read for you an actual quote about Finnegan's Wake from the Wikipedia article on the book, and I can't stress enough this is a book that came out 85 years ago. Despite the obstacles, readers and commentators have reached a broad consensus about the book's central cast of characters and, to a lesser degree, the plot, but key details remain elusive.
Yeah, even by the standards of modernism, which got very experimental, I think James Joyce is considered one of the most experimental.
That is fair. Do we have room in this? I mean, it is a longer set of notes I have for us here. But would you like just on air to read the first chapter of Finnegan's Wake, or the first couple of sentences of Finnegan's Wake?
I would love to. All right, hit me. Send me that link.
It's in Discord, courtesy of the Joyce Project, which has wonderful annotated copies of Joyce if you want to do that for some reason.
Oh boy. Okay.
Yep.
The moment I looked at this capitalization, I knew it was going to be a rough one. All right, let's see how far I can get.
All right.
River run past even Adams from swerve of shore to bend of bay brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environs. Sir Tristram.
Yeah, it switches to French.
There's a lot of French. Oh, good Lord. Okay.
Yep.
Violet d'Amour, from o'er the short sea, had Passencourt re-arrived from North America on this side of... Oh, my God.
Yeah, when do we get the idea?
Okay, yeah, he's doing a... Wow, okay, you didn't tell me about this. The next paragraph contains what looks like a key smash, although I presume that he wrote this out with pencil and paper. Actually, so he's doing what looks kind of like a parody of like Mordauthur or something, with the switching back and forth between English and French phrases and the sort of old-timey pattern of speech, and he's making up fake old-timey sounding words, and it's getting kind of more and more ridiculous as it goes on, to the point that I don't physically know how I can make my mouth make some of these sounds.
Yeah, it's a real journey. I think we should put it in the show notes just so people get a chance to see why I hate James Joyce so much. And after he finished Finnegan's Wake, 2 years later, he would have surgery on an ulcer and die of complications as a result. So we never got to see what other insane shit he was going to cook up, but I mean...
Okay, I'm actually really curious. When he released this, was it taken as a joke? Did he release this with a completely straight face, but like acting like this was serious literature?
I genuinely do not know. I did find a quote as I was reading about Joyce that he basically said, "I write obscurity shit," and I am obviously somewhat editorializing the quote here, to make it hard to interpret so that people will keep talking about me because they don't know what I'm trying to say, so my ideas will live forever. And I do think that is bullshit, personally. I hate it, but...
I would say this is almost like literary Dadaism. Like the level of like kind of trolling you for thinking that you're going to be able to understand this. That's like the closest I can come to categorizing this.
Just like regular Dadaism, it's nonsense, because if you just want to create nonsense, I can ask a 4-year-old to just come up with some nonsense for me, and they'll do it. Like,
I will defend Dadaism, but
anyway,
this is...
Anyway. So, Joyce, as Dimitri has already said, is part of a literary movement called modernism, which has a few different wings. Artistically, Dadaism is one of them, and I do think this could be argued to be a type of literary Dadaism. Basically, the idea of modernism is it starts from the modern world is confusing and complicated, and we need new types of expression to kind of deal with that. And then all the different sort of approaches to how you express yourself differently to deal with the complications of modern life are like the different wings of modernism. And it's a very complicated movement beyond that. We don't really have room to get into it. But I just want to be upfront here. I hate modernist writing. I'm going to be honest with you. For a lot of the reasons Demetria already said, it's very experimental, and some of those experiments, like an emphasis on psychological realism, have been very successful. I think that's fair. But most of the spaghetti ended up on the floor. Most of those experiments did not work in terms of making a book that is interesting to read, and then therefore they can be kind of a slog and unpleasant to get through. I do also have a personal loathing for modernism because the two most commonly taught modernist authors in the U.S. are noted anti-Semite and weirdo Virginia Woolf, who was married a Jewish man and then was horrific to both him and her in-laws. And also, I hate Mrs. Dalloway. I find it interminable as a story, but that's beyond the point. And F. Scott Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby, which is just a book that is horrifically casually anti-Semitic, but that never really gets covered when anyone teaches it in high school. It was really cool to just be handed a book as like a 9th grader that had like the K slur casually dropped in it in the first chapter. That was fun. Really loved that.
I think there actually were a fair number of Jewish modernists. They definitely were in art.
I mean, probably, but they don't get taught in the U.S.
They don't get included in the canon, do they?
Again, not in American literature. So that's Joyce and the modernist movement. Now we should talk a bit about Ulysses before we get to the trial of the text. And this is a book that, unlike Finnegan's Wake, is at least actually about something, from what I can tell. It's originally a short story that Joyce works on starting in 1906, but then becomes a huge novel. The name, of course, comes from the Latin version of Odysseus, the hero of the Odyssey, with his famous 10-year journey to get home after the Trojan War, all the trials and tribulations of that. And basically the narrative is trying to set up a parallel between the story of Odysseus, who is this great hero of literature, and the story of its protagonist, this just rando who lives in Dublin over the course of one day of his life. That day, by the way, is June 16th, 1904. The whole story takes place over the course of that day. So it's intended to be kind of an ironic, notion of this great hero tale, this great adventure being played out in parallel by this guy who's kind of a loser. And particularly the protagonist is Leopold Bloom, who is, I guess you'd call him half Jewish. He's the child of a Jewish father and a Catholic mother. He is Odysseus. His wife, Molly, is Penelope, Odysseus' wife. And Joyce just had this weird self-insert character he would put into his work called Stephen Daedalus, and he's supposed to be Telemachus, who is the son of Odysseus and Penelope. So that's basically what the book's about. I'm not going to try and summarize the plot because I think that would be insane. It's really complicated. I do find this book a little annoying, both for all the reasons I find Joyce annoying in general, and because people tend to be very celebratory about Leo Bloom as this like Jewish protagonist who's shown with depth and sensitivity. I think it's better than some of the other portrayals of Jews in media at the time. But there's a lot of especially weird stuff about masculinity and sex in Bloom's character that I think really plays into some shitty stereotypes, combined with Joyce's insistence that his protagonist had to be a foreigner, not really Irish or fully Irish. I think that it reads weird, but no more so than like the casual background anti-Semitism of the 1920s. But I'm really tired of seeing, like, I saw so many Joyce people jerking themselves off about like, oh, what a sensitive portrayal of the Jewish. It's like, fuck you, come on.
Okay, in fairness, when you read other literature produced around the same
it's
time,
better
the
than
bar
that.
gets set very low. And I say this actually, I really love a lot of pulp literature produced around this time, so I've read some fairly rancid stuff.
So, among pretentious people, this book is still, of course, very well regarded. We don't care about that. What matters for us is Joyce's commitment to literary realism. He's a big believer in this idea of a realistic inner monologue and a realistic character, which means including a bunch of stuff that would be considered to be obscene by the publication standards of the time. For us, a particularly important chapter is going to be entitled Nausicaa. All of the chapters have pretentious names from the Odyssey. Nausicaa specifically is the daughter of the king of Crete in the Odyssey, who has the hots for Odysseus. She sees him naked the first time she sees him, and she's like, oh, so hot. But of course, the love is unrequited because he has to get home. In Ulysses, the Nausicaa chapter is mostly about Leopold Bloom creeping on an underage girl named Gertie McDowell. Her legs get kind of out while she's watching the fireworks at the beach with some friends and her younger brother Jackie. And basically he sees her legs, gets really horny, and surreptitiously rubs one out in his pants. That's the plot of the chapter. I do also have the section of the text, which is like a solid long paragraph where he orgasms, if you would like me to read that out loud.
Okay. Let's hear that one.
Okay, I'm going to try, but this is, again, very Joycean and deeply irritating, so I'm going to do my best here, and I'm going to trip over a lot of stuff. As Jackie Caffrey, the younger brother, shouted to look, there was another, and she leaned back, and the garters were blue to match on account of the transparent, and they all saw it, and shouted to look, there it was, and she leaned back ever so far to see the fireworks, and something queer was flying about through the air, a soft thing to and fro, dark. and she saw a long Roman candle going up over the trees, up, and in the tense hush, they were all breathless with excitement as it went higher and higher, and she had to lean back more and more to look up after it, high, almost out of sight, and her face was suffused with a divine and entrancing blush from straining back, and he could see her other things too, nainsook knickers and the fabric that caresses the skin, better than those other pettywith, the green 4-11, on account of being white, and she let him, and she saw that he saw it, and then went so high it went out of sight a moment, and she was trembling in every limb from being bent back so far, and he had a full view high up above her knee, where no one ever, not even on the swing or waiting, and she wasn't ashamed, and he wasn't either, to look in that immodest way like that, because he couldn't resist the sight of the wondrous revealment half offered, like those skirt dancers behaving so immodest before gentlemen looking up, and he kept looking. She would fain have cried to him chokingly, held out her snowy slender arms to him to come to feel his lips laid on her white brow, the cry of a young girl's love, a little strangled cry, wrung from her, that cry that has rung through the ages. And then a rocket sprang and bang shot blind, blank, and oh, and then the Roman candle burst, and it was like a sigh of oh, and everyone cried oh, in raptures, and it gushed out of it a stream of rain, gold hair, threads, and they shed, and and there were all green dewy stars falling with golden, oh, so lovely, oh, so soft, sweet, soft.
I don't say this often, but I think I prefer postmodernism.
So, summarized, if you just heard me say that and you're like, what the fuck just happened there? Fair enough, first of all. But as the legal scholar Edward de Grazia summarizes it, the sight of Gertie caused Bloom to have an orgasm, but probably only the careful reader noticed that. This isn't the only example, though it's the most relevant for us for reasons we'll get into. The text talks about menstruation. Bloom asks Molly to give him head at one point, and arguably there's also a section where he goes down on her, but it's kind of hard to read the meaning out. And then the very last chapter, Penelope, is way more sexual than all the previous ones. It's Molly reminiscing about her affairs, but it matters less to us. Nausicaa is the chapter that's really going to be the tricky one here. So yeah, that's basically the thing with Ulysses, is it's committed to this realism. And of course, because real life is kind of horny, that means the book has to be kind of horny, which flies in the trend of the time, even though it is expressed in horrifically stultifying literary language.
All right. Okay. I'm really holding fast to my idea that art should remain uncensored, even if I think it is both gross and I'm really struggling to defend the artistic merit of this, but I do believe in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things where, like, in 1921, this probably felt pretty fresh because of the experimental structure and style. But the thing about plowing new experimental ground is that it has since been trod in the subsequent century with way better examples of doing the same thing. So it's mostly of interest, I think, if you are a literary historian looking at how this is developed. But that's just me. Anyway, we don't have to talk about Joyce anymore, and only a little bit about Ulysses, because really this is not about the text. It is about the people who published the text. Because Joyce is living in Switzerland for most of his life, and he's not a publisher, so he's not really liable for obscenity. The crime is distributing obscenity. It's not the creation of obscenity. Instead, we're going to focus on his publisher, his first one in the United States, a woman by the name of Margaret Anderson, who is one of our two pretty central figures today. So Anderson is born in Indianapolis in 1886. She's the eldest of three daughters, doesn't really like Indianapolis much because she clearly has taste, and so moves to Chicago in 1908. She starts off in literature as a book reviewer while she's in college for a Christian religious magazine, but eventually falls in with avant-garde literature, presumably because it's more fun, at least, than Christian literature. And so she ends up founding a literary magazine in 1914 called The Little Review. It's named after the Little Theater in Chicago. It's, again, devoted to modernist work as a kind of magazine, but not just that. Actually, Emma Goldman is an early contributor from the Criminal Records movie universe.
Oh, wait. I might actually have, in the Emma Goldman show notes, have published a cartoon from the Little Review.
It's quite possible.
The one where she's joking about going to Emma Goldman lectures and like kind of suffering through them.
Yep.
I think that might have been from the Little Review. Okay.
Yeah. And Goldman again contributed to the text. She wrote some stuff about the relationship between anarchism and art. So this is like a very political magazine, not just a literary one. It'll relocate a few times. The magazine staff moves from Chicago to San Francisco in 1916 and then eventually to Greenwich Village in 1917. And along the way through those moves, Anderson will meet the other protagonist for today, Jane Heap, born in 1883 in Topeka, Kansas, also very wisely leaving Kansas for somewhere more exciting, has become very involved in the art scene, and both Heap and Anderson are pretty openly bisexual and actually will be lovers throughout pretty much this entire narrative.
You know what? I know a lot of bi women working in publishing. That tradition has continued to this day.
They're off in Greenwich Village, creating their bisexual, modernist, anarchist literary magazine. They do then fall in with, unfortunately, American expat, noted fascist piece of shit, and probable future episode candidate Ezra Pound, who sucks shit. I hate Ezra Pound because he's a fascist and also just interminable and boring. But Pound lives in the UK at this point. He basically he reaches out to Anderson after she complains in one issue about the quality of submissions she's getting and says, "I'll send you my work." He's a reasonably well-regarded poet at this point. I'm also friends with fellow anti-Semitic weirdo T.S. Eliot and with John Butler Yeats, and they'll send their work too if you just lay aside a section of the magazine for us to put our work in. Basically offering to kind of collect these elite writings and send them over to the UK. Pound is also the one who suggests Joyce in general and Ulysses in particular as something the magazine could publish, which I do think is probably the single biggest black mark against Ulysses, that a guy like Ezra Pound was like, oh, this is good. But it's still a pretty good deal. These people have name recognition, and so Anderson and Heap say yes. Pound also connects the two of them with a guy who will be important in the future, John Quinn, who is a lawyer by trade but has made a lot of bank and become very interested in art, and so he is willing to help fund the magazine out of his personal wealth. So, by late 1917, Joyce is sending manuscripts of Ulysses to Ezra Pound, who is forwarding them to Anderson, who is now thinking about serializing them. January 1918, she decides, okay, we're going to do it, announces to the readership of the magazine that they're going to start serializing a prose masterpiece. That's what she calls it. And the first issue with an installment of Ulysses goes out in March 1918. So the publication starts, but it's being done chapter by chapter at this point. And that brings us to American obscenity law in 1918. So, a quick refresher, because we have covered this before. America is a common law system. Precedents are derived from previous cases. In 1918, the precedent is being derived from a British case when it comes to obscenity law, which is called Regina, Queen versus Hicklin. Just like in the America, it's like the United States versus whoever. In Britain, it's always Regina or Rex versus whoever.
Yeah, that's the really fun thing about America. Well, there are many fun quirks of the American legal system, but a particularly fun thing is that we can use Britain's precedents.
It is true.
So if anyone is getting invaded by Vikings, that precedent, it's still on the books, right?
I believe it is, and no one has ever written a law that I'm aware of banning it. So when the Canadians come raiding to take our salmon supply, we'll be ready. Anyway, Regina versus Hicklin establishes the obscenity standard of whether the tendency of the matter is to deprave and corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral influences and into whose hands a publication of this sort might fall. The case comes from a satire involving the Catholic Church that was published in Britain in 1868. Basically, the satire depicts the church as this depraved institution where women are getting molested in confessionals.
Okay, so this is interesting because we've done cases where America got kind of pre-Revolutionary War precedents from Britain.
We'll get there. We have a figure to introduce who's important for bringing this over.
I'm just very curious about how we managed to get a precedent from another country.
It's because of your favorite figure in American history. Anyway, the original case is about how whether because it's a satire, this is still obscene, or if it's protected because the intent is not to be sexy but to make fun of the church. And the finding is it doesn't matter what the intent is. It's just about this notion of the tendency of whether any part in isolation could be considered horny. And so that becomes case law in Great Britain, and it is very inspirational to who, Demetria?
Is it Anthony Comstock?
It sure is Anthony Comstock.
No. My favorite guy who used his post office powers to absolutely run a riot over things in America he probably should not have had control over.
Absolutely. Noted piece of shit Anthony Comstock, who I think we will come back to quite a bit over the course of basically anything we do about obscenity in America. If you don't know who Comstock is, he's a New York-based Civil War veteran who finds God super hard and gets really into combating obscenity out of a sense of religious obligation. And so in the 1870s, he lobbies Congress to pass what he calls the Act for the Suppression of Trade in and Circulation of Obscene Literature and Articles of Immoral Use, which is a mouthful, so today we just call it the Comstock Law. And because it's been amended a few times, you'll often hear people talking about the Comstock Laws. For us, the part that matters is every obscene, lewd, lascivious, indecent, filthy, or vile matter, thing, device, or substance is declared to be non-mailable matter and shall not be conveyed in the mails or delivered from any post office or by any letter carrier. Fun fact, and this is important today, the law also bans anything related to abortion from being carried by the post service.
Yes, you are actually probably going to see the Comstock laws in the news quite a lot because they were written before anyone really conceived of the idea of abortion being administered by pill that could be delivered by mail. But they do apply. The question is, do they apply? Especially if you're mailing things across state lines. So that will probably be a different episode. But just be aware the Comstock laws are going to be a hot topic this year.
His shitty legacy is still with us. So Comstock gets himself deputized as a postal inspector after this, and founds the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, which is given powers by the New York State Legislature, to impound obscene material and find people responsible for producing it. So it's basically deputized. And Comstock's efforts lead to a series of cases that then establish the Hicklin test for obscenity in American law. Most notably is the case Rosen versus United States from 1896, which we talked about in our episode on Lenny Bruce. I think it's about a pamphlet depicting a woman having sex with a horse and a carriage driver, but the actual complaint is so flowery I literally can't tell what's obscene about it. Anyway, Comstock is dead by the time Ulysses is published. He dies in 1915, but he's already, unfortunately, by that point, inspired a young law student who came to hear him speak. Do you know who that is?
Oh, I don't actually.
J. Edgar Hoover.
Oh, I was just talking about some J. Edgar Hoover cases with a friend.
Oh, stay fucking tuned. Anyway, Anthony Comstock, unfortunately, while he is dead, his laws are still there. The New York Society for the Suppression of Vice is still there. And that brings us to the publication of Ulysses.
J. Edgar Hoover, speaking of a man who was rumored to have done some kind of obscenity that was used as blackmail against him.
Absolutely. So this all makes the publication of Ulysses in 1918 very political. And to be fair, the Little Review already is political. Again, it's 1918. The United States has just entered World War I. Both Anderson and Heap have established positions as anti-war radicals. Remember, they're friends of Emma Goldman's. They actually protest her arrest and deportation with Alex Berkman when that happens, previous episode, and get booted from their lease for the Little Review's office for doing it, for being like pro-Goldman, pro-Berkman. The October 1917 edition is also suppressed under the regime of wartime censorship because of a short story called The Cantleman's Springmate, which is about a soldier awaiting deployment. He's very nervous about it, so he distracts himself by seducing a girl, getting her pregnant, and then abandoning her. And so their magazine gets suppressed for publishing what is perceived to be an anti-war piece of literature. They are defended for the first but not the last time in court by their funder, John Quinn, the lawyer. He is a fan of Joyce. He's a fan of modernist literature in general, but he hates Anderson and Heap and only tolerates them because they will publish one of his favorite authors, and they'll publish the kind of stuff he likes, even though he's really very reactionary. He will successfully defend them against Sedition Act charges for publishing the story, but also accuses them privately, saying, like, you did this because you're anti-war, because you're sympathetic for Goldman, you published this short story, and I know it, and you need to stop doing it. He also knows the two of them are in a same-sex relationship, and speaks very disparagingly about that to his bestie, Ezra Pound, noted fascist shit heap. This is a quote from a letter he sent to Pound. Quote, or it's in that anyone reading the magazine would say the person or persons responsible suffered from sex mania or the obsession with sex, or that they were taking out on paper and in type what they should have taken out between some man or woman's legs.
Wow, buddy. Okay, so, all right, this guy who has absolutely no principled reason to be involved in this case whatsoever, but just loves whatever they're publishing, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, from what I can tell, he really hates them because they are women who don't listen to him. He complains about that to Pound, too. That they have their own opinions, and in particular that they are willing to publish stuff that he thinks is, like, beyond what's acceptable experimentation.
You know what? I know a lot of bisexual women who don't like listening to men and publishing. This is all squaring with my experience.
The more things change, the more they stay the same. Interestingly, Quinn also, while he loves Joyce, he hates Ulysses. He thinks it is the worst thing Joyce ever wrote. I think he died before Finnegan's Wake came out, so don't have the review there. But he calls it toilet room literature, pissoir art subject to damnation in 30 seconds by any court or jury, and will actually pull his funding from the Little Review in 1918 over the publication of Ulysses.
You know what? I gotta say, this guy does have a good turn of phrase.
I mean, you can tell he's a lawyer by trade.
Okay, I can see if you are funding someone's experimental literary magazine and they start putting this stuff in it, I think you might be asking some questions about what they are doing with that money. If
books are wrong.
Well, I mean, publishing is a business, and I don't see how anyone would pay for this, although quite a few people did.
Yeah, to be fair to Anderson and Heap, they published this because they believe in it. From what the finances were always very shaky, and spoilers, the Little Review will go under eventually. So I don't think they were making a return, which I think might have also been part of the challenge there.
Again, all squaring with my experience with publishing here.
So by 1919, Ulysses is drawing a lot of heat towards the magazine. The January 1919 issue is suppressed by the post office, as is the May one. These are the 7th and 8th chapters of Ulysses. I'm not really sure why they get suppressed. 7 talks a bit about STDs, I think, but it's not really clear. And the post office, when it's citing the Comstock laws, doesn't really give a real response when they're asked for clarification. They just say the magazine was suppressed based on its overall content, not naming anything specific.
I believe the Comstock laws were often used to go after anything related to family planning or sexual health. So that might actually have pinged something in a way a straight up sex scene didn't.
I mean, I also think the Society for the Prevention of Vice was just sort of going after these people for being mouthy broads. So the January 1920 edition gets suppressed again. The post office actually seizes and burns all copies of the magazine based on the supposed obscenity of the next chapter of Ulysses, which is called Cyclops. I skimmed that chapter. I genuinely do not understand why this got suppressed. From what I can tell, it's just about Leo Bloom going to the pub and dealing with some generic anti-Semitism. And I read it, and it just has this very classic Gentile, why can't the Jews and the Gentiles just get along and we can all be friends? I don't know. This doesn't seem special or interesting at all. But also, again, I don't like this book or James Joyce, so maybe I'm being unfair.
I'm going to UlyssesGuide.com to see a summary of Cyclops.
All right, well, you figure that out. I can tell you why the next part gets dinged, and this is the important one. August 1920 is the big moment for the text because a daughter of a member of the Society for the Suppression of Vice somehow, who knows how, gets her hands on a copy of the next issue, which contains the chapter Nausicaa, which is the one of Leo Bloom jerking one out in his pants. Then her dad ends up reading the text, passes it on to John Sumner, who is the new secretary after Tony Comstock's death. And so Sumner, because he's been deputized by the New York State Legislature to do this, issues a warrant, because he can do that, for the arrest of Anderson and Heap for violating New York's own obscenity laws, the state laws, which are based on the model of the Comstock laws. And I want to quote here, just because Jane Heap has a very iconic response to the charge that I think is worth kind of reading into the record of the podcast. Mr. Joyce was not teaching early Egyptian perversions or inventing new ones. Girls lean back everywhere, showing lace and silk stockings, wear low-cut sleeveless blouses, breathless bathing suits. Men think thoughts and have emotions about these things everywhere, seldom as delicately and imaginatively as Mr. Bloom, and no one is corrupted. Right, so that's her kind of response to the charge, but that doesn't really, it's still a charge.
So it's interesting that this is her response to the charge and not, hey, this is based on Greek mythology, famously very obscene.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how, because I imagine people who are learning Greek mythology at this point, they're reading from Bowdlerized editions of it. They don't really know what's in there.
Even a Bowdlerized edition is still going to contain a lot of Zeus turning into various animals and objects and raping women. The obscenity is kind of hard to fully remove from some of these myths, and they would have been fairly common knowledge.
That's the fundamental issue with obscenity law, right? Is it's just arbitrary bullshit what you do or do not call obscene, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
I'm interested in the fact that a lot of obscenity trials, people try to make an argument over what does and doesn't have artistic merit, and they often point to whatever their classical inspiration was, and it's interesting that they're not doing it in this case.
I mean, I guess it's more about them defending their publication than Joyce defending what he wrote, because again, he's in Zurich, he's not there for any of this. So the pre-trial hearings start in November 1920. The actual first trial takes place in February 1921. John Quinn once again decides he will be the lawyer for the accused. He says he's doing it for Joyce, not for them. It's unclear why they took him up on this. Anderson and Heap will write recollections of the trial after the fact, and Anderson will say that he actually yells at them when they're in jail that they belong in there after they're arrested. But Anderson would later write in her autobiography, which is called My 30 Years' War, one didn't argue with John Quinn. One enjoyed his performances too much. He was better than a prima donna. No woman would throw such obvious scenes or look around so hopefully for the applause of her audience. So I know she says she just found them entertaining. Quinn, meanwhile, is willing to do this, but just seems to hate them. Again, here is a actual letter that he wrote to Ezra Pound, noted fascist, talking about his decision to defend them. I have no interest at all in defending people who are stupidly and brazenly and saphoistically and drastically and urinally and menstrually violating the law and think they are courageous. They, Anderson and Heap, are bores. They are too damn fresh. They stand for no principle. They are cheap self-advertisers. All pederasts want to go into court. Bringing libel suits is one of the stigmata of buggery. The bugger and lesbian constantly think in terms of suits and defenses.
He makes these two ladies sound so cool.
He really does. So the actual trial starts in February 1921. It's a state trial that is tried just by a panel of judges, I believe, because it is considered to be a misdemeanor at this point, violating obscenity law in New York. And according to Anderson, 2 of the 3 judges actually sleep through most of the trial, which is pretty clear. They've made their minds up already. Anderson and Heap are pretty clearly trying to defend what they see as legitimate art and free speech, and they know they're going to lose, but they want to kind of make their case publicly, very similar to what Emma Goldman does when she gets arrested. I really want to read out Heap's comment. Anderson is a pretty good one too, actually, but this is her after the fact writing about the trial. The heavy farce and sad futility of trying a creative work in a court of law appalls me. Was there ever a judge qualified to judge even the simplest psychic outburst? The society from which Mr. Sumner is agent, I am told, was founded to protect the public from corruption. When asked what public, its defenders spring to the rock on which America was founded, the cream puff of sentimentality, and answer chivalrously, our young girls. So the mind of the young girl rules this country? If there is anything I really fear, it is the mind of the young girl.
Oh man, I am really feeling the resonance throughout history of the eternal panic over what is corrupting the young girl. I feel like we're much more efficient at distributing obscene material to young women these days through the internet, and arguing about what they're consuming and whether it is morally edifying. But the fight goes on.
Yeah, it is really interesting how much the kind of same arguments just get repeated over and over again. You'd think we'd make our fucking minds up at some point. Anyway, John Quinn as their lawyer while this is happening is doing... I don't want to sound judgmental, but just, I mean, I guess he hates them, so he's just trying to, like, spike the football here. I don't really get it. His pre-trial and his argument during the trial is essentially there are two different kinds of filth, and these are the actual terms he used. The strong, hard filth of a man like Joyce is the first type, and then there's the soft, flabby man like Wilde, like Oscar Wilde. And his argument is Oscar Wilde and his ilk unquestionably corrupt morals, and therefore they violate obscenity law, but Joyce's hard filth is incomprehensible unless you are already corrupted, like Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap, and therefore the text was filthy, but not dangerous to public morals because you already have to be a horny train wreck just to understand what's happening. That is his actual argument.
Wow, that is a fascinating argument, especially considering I don't recall Oscar Wilde actually producing any obscene material. He just sort of projected that on him because Oscar Wilde would have been known to be gay, right?
I would assume. I mean, I'm not that familiar with Wilde's canon of work.
I'm thinking about it, and like, I mean, his famous trial is what he goes down for. It is sodomy. It's not obscenity. I mean, Oscar Wilde was a pretty popular producer of pretty inoffensive, for the most part, literature. The parts that were considered offensive, you got to read a lot into it.
I mean, you got to read a lot of Joyce to get anything out of it, I guess. So that's his argument, again, during the pretrial hearing and the trial itself, despite the fact that the judges disagree and dismiss this argument in the pretrial. They've already said they won't accept it. One of the judges says no one could miss, quote, the episode where the man went off in his pants, unquote. And then actually at the actual trial, Quinn repeats this argument again anyway, spends a bunch of time attacking a bunch of women who've come out to the audience of the trial to express support for Anderson and Heap. He spends most of the time implying that they're all there because they're sex perverts and lesbians, and then calls 3 expert witnesses for the defense, but won't let Heap and Anderson testify in their own defense. The first is Philip Moeller of what's called the Theater Guild, an experimental theater, who gives a whole testimony. He just gets up in front of the judges and gives a lecture about the connection between Ulysses and Freudian psychoanalysis. And the actual response from one of the judges is, here, you might as well talk Russian, speak plain English if you want us to understand what you're saying.
Okay, this is such a hilarious argument given how obsessed with sex Freudian psychoanalysis is. I mean, like, reading anything by Freud is going to involve way more graphic discussion of sex than this rocket going off extremely flowery language that is in the actual text being discussed.
Well, it doesn't matter because the judges don't know what the fuck he's saying. The second witness is Schofield Thayer, who's the editor of another literary magazine called The Dial. I don't know why Quinn thought this was a good idea because Thayer just testifies, I wouldn't have published Ulysses because it's gross, and even if I had wanted to, I would have talked to my lawyer first and followed their advice not to publish it. And then the last witness, John Cowper. The last witness is John Cowper Powys, who's a literary man himself. He's the only good one. He calls Ulysses, quote, a beautiful piece of work in no way capable of corrupting a young girl. And yeah, that's the whole argument. His summary, Quinn's final argument for the defense is essentially to apologize for publishing Ulysses, and say, I myself do not understand Ulysses. I think Joyce has carried his method too far. To which one of the judges responds, yes, it sounds to me like the ravings of a disordered mind. I can't see why anyone would want to publish it. Anderson would later say she almost leapt out of the chair to go start yelling at the two of them, and Heap has to physically restrain her to avoid getting her arrested for contempt, essentially.
I love these women so much. I feel like any young girl who's that determined to be corrupted that she's willing to read all of Ulysses. I mean, I think something was going to get her sooner or later. I think she's working pretty hard at that corruption.
There's also one more, before we move on from the trial, I think we can all guess what the verdict is, but there's one more funny moment I do just want to note, where the assistant DA wants to read out the passage I read from Nausicaa as part of the prosecution to establish that it is obscene. The judge bars the DA from doing this and says, we have two impressionable young ladies here, he points to Anderson and Heap, who should not hear that sort of thing. And then the DA reminds him, they're the publishers. And the judge says, quote, I am sure they did, I'm sure she, I think it was referring to Anderson, I am sure she did not know the significance of what she was publishing.
Wow, what paternalistic bullshit. Holy shit.
And so that is the end of the trial, pretty much. Of course, it's a guilty verdict. How could it not be? The text obviously violates the Hicklin standard if you're going by it. The only mitigating factor is the sheer incomprehensibility of Ulysses. And so the two of them get a $100 fine. Today, that is $1,697.46, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They are also fingerprinted and put on probation, and they are banned from further publication of Ulysses. As they're going out of the courtroom, there's one last exchange with John Quinn, where he says, quote, and now for God's sake, don't publish any more obscene literature. Anderson asks, how will I know if it's obscene? And he says, quote, I'm sure I don't know, but don't do it.
Oh my God, what a fucking comeback from Anderson of I have just been told by the judge that my lady brain is not advanced enough to even understand this obscenity. So, oops, maybe I'll just accidentally publish some more obscene literature because I can't understand it. I'm just a lady. I love her. I love these women so much.
My overwhelming sense from this all the research I did on this is just I want to party with these ladies. They sound cool as hell.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, there's not a lot of public sentiment encouraging them. The New York Times editorial board, in its long tradition of being on the wrong side of history and then only later coming around, will praise the decision not to imprison them and make them martyrs, which Anderson actually will later say, maybe I should have made them imprison me like Emma Goldman and really make a stand. But also the editorial board calls the novel offensive filth, and basically it's trash. It shouldn't have been published. And after all this, Anderson will be a little dejected. She'll end up leaving the U.S., giving control of the little review to Jane Heap, and moving back and forth between Paris and occasional stints in New York until her death in 1973. Heap will end up doing the same thing after the little review folds in 1928, until her own death in 1964. My understanding is that they remained in contact. I don't know about their romantic relationship. They did have other partners after this point. But I do believe they now are inducted into the Gay and Lesbian Hall of Fame in Chicago. So, good for them.
Good for them. Yeah, piecing out to a place that practiced the Napoleonic Code was something a lot of folks felt the need to do in this era, yes.
But we are not done with Ulysses yet. There's one more thing we have to talk about, because you will notice I have now successfully accessed Ulysses. I believe you could buy it at most bookstores, though I don't know why you would want to. And so the question is, of course, how is that possible? And that brings us to the second Ulysses case.
Oh, you didn't tell me there was a sequel to Ulysses 2 Furious.
It's a twofer, baby. So in 1922, the year after Anderson and Heap lose their case, Ulysses is published in its entirety in, of course, Paris. There's own complicated legal wrangling around that, but it is published. In 1932, there's this newfangled American publishing company you may have heard of that had been founded just 5 years earlier called A Random House. and they are looking to make it big in the US, and they want the rights to publish Ulysses in America.
And I just don't think they're going to make it in such a crowded market.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously no one has ever talked about Random House ever again. The thinking is that by this point, Ulysses has more of an established literary reputation. As a classic, it can fall back on the artistic merit argument. B, both Sumner and the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice had just lost a pretty high-profile obscenity battle over the famous lesbian novel The Well of Loneliness. This is a future case involving Radcliffe Hall, who is very interesting in her own right, as sort of the, this conversation around obscenity there. And that seems to suggest that there is appetite for a legal challenge, that Random House could successfully mount it, and that would make the publisher into a major player. They would have secured this kind of very famous work that could cement Random House's legacy. And so the leadership of Random House, the two publishers at this point are Bennett Cerf and Donald Klopfer, approach the American Civil Liberties Union and a lawyer who works for the ACLU by the name of Morris Ernst. And of course, with a name like that, he is a nice Jewish boy. Born in Alabama, he has a reputation for defending free speech around obscenity, including material to access sex education, and works for the ACLU. Because of it, he actually was the one who won the Well of Loneliness case.
How many times have we done a case where the ACLU kind of rides in to rescue at the end?
Yeah, I mean, I find them really interesting. I do think I want to do the Skokie Nazi March at some point, which is one where that's a little more ambiguity around the ACLU. But, overall, I think they do pretty great work. Civil liberties exist for a reason. I guess we'll get to it at the end of the episode. Anyway, the plan is Random House is going to go to Joyce, get him to sign off on publication. The deal he signs is a $1,000 advance, plus another $1,500 on day of publication. Today, that is $21,000 and $32,000. And then after that's signed, they're going to import a single copy of the French edition of Ulysses, because it's still in English. It's published in France, but not translated. They're going to import it into the US. They will make sure it gets seized, and then they will have standing to sue to overturn the ban. And because it's one imported copy, there's a lot less legal exposure for them if they lose than if it's a case where they've already published and there's much more kind of legal exposure.
Yes, this is a really common thing the ACLU does have to do, is they have to have a criminal case that they can then defend. So yeah, that's some really interesting, deliberately arranging of making sure that that you can create your own case there.
So actually, hilariously, when it first goes through customs, the copy is not seized. It is delivered to the Random House office in New York. And so Morris Ernst literally walks it back to customs processing and is like, "This is obscene. You have to seize it." And they do. So then it goes to the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, whose name is George Z. Medallier, who spends 7 months actually debating, do I want to press charges here? Because he can always decide just not to. He's actually a fan of Ulysses. He thinks modernist literature is pretty cool, but eventually decides, okay, I have an obligation to uphold the law. This falls under obscenity law as I understand it. Therefore, regardless of my personal opinion, where I think it's stupid, I am obligated to contend that this violates the Tariff Act of 1930, which bans importing obscene material as defined by the Hincklin Standard.
Interesting. So we have a DA who's kind of coming from the other side with his principles and his preferences.
Pretty much. And so this leads to I wouldn't even call a trial, really a hearing, because both sides waive their jury trial right. So there's a hearing in front of the federal judge, John Woolsey, who basically will read Ulysses and then hear arguments from both sides and then make a decision. Right? It's pretty straightforward.
I'm a little disappointed that this was not a jury trial, because I would love to hear about a bunch of New Yorkers attempting to understand Ulysses.
Hey, it sounds like a bunch of bullshit. I'm walking here. Forget about it.
You're going a little New Jersey there.
What? Don't criticize art. So Medallier's contention about the book is essentially threefold. A, Ulysses is sexual in nature, especially the last section, which has since been published. Not just Nausicaa, but the last bit is from Molly Brown's perspective, where she recounts fucking a bunch of other guys. It's pretty horny. Second, that it is blasphemous in its depiction of the Catholic Church in Ireland, and that's also obscene. And that third, it surfaced inappropriate ideas by discussing things like masturbation or menstruation that are usually repressed, not discussed in polite society, and thus violate the Hicklin standard.
Well, this is interesting because I wasn't aware blasphemy was a crime in the United States. I thought freedom of religion also meant freedom to exercise your First Amendment right to be a blasphemer against religion.
I mean, I guess you could make the argument that blasphemy depraves and corrupts those whose minds are open to such immoral influences. That doesn't just have to be sex. If that, and that's the Hicklin standard, so I guess that's the argument. But I do think Morris Ernst, for the defense, has, of course, the way stronger argument. His case is first, of course, the First Amendment, protected speech. Obviously, this is America. You can say whatever the fuck you want. You know, insert Battle Hymn of the Republic as the backing track for all this. This is what America was built on, goddammit. The second chunk of the argument is actually, beyond this, you can't realistically read Ulysses as obscene because it's too difficult. No one who is impressionable could really read this book. They would have, they'd have to already have their minds made up. It can't corrupt people who aren't, again, kind of a version of the Quinn argument, aren't already like corrupted.
This is not entry-level porn. This is advanced. You have to have read other
it is
porn
advanced
to get
pornography.
This is porn.
There's one point where he actually reads a bunch of obscure phrases into the court record to prove that if you are impressionable, you would not make it more than a few pages in. I do have this if you would like to see the list of phrases that he read.
I would love to hear these phrases.
Okay, he first goes through some of the vocabulary that includes words like parallax, signets, eneleki, yogi bogi box, hoithnum, Jesus, demi-semi-quaver, and then he reads out a whole paragraph. Inelectable modality of the visible, at least that if no more, thought through my eyes, signature of all things I am here to read, sea-pon and sea-rack, the nearing tide, that rusty boot, snot green, blue, silver, rust, colored signs, limits of the diaphane, but he adds in bodies, then he was aware of them, sure, go easy, bald he was, and a millionaire, maestro de calor que sanno, limit of the diaphane in, why, diaphane, adiaphane, if you can put your 5 fingers through it, it is a gate, if not a door, shut your eyes and see.
Do we need to pause this podcast and get you to the hospital?
I mean, I think my brain is broken from having to read that. And then the last bit, he just reads a bunch of book reviews calling Ulysses a great work of literature. So that's basically the argument.
There has got to be an easier way to corrupt the youth.
You would think, right? I think there are more straightforward ways to do this. And so unsurprisingly, on December 6th, 1933, the trial judge, John Woolsey, pens his verdict, and he says Morris is right. What he says is, quote, in Ulysses, in spite of its unusual frankness, I do not detect anywhere the leer of the sensualist. I hold, therefore, it is not pornographic. In writing Ulysses, Joyce sought to make a serious experiment in a new, if not wholly novel literary genre. He takes persons of the lower middle class living in Dublin and seeks not only to describe what they did on a certain day early in June of that year as they went about the city bent on their usual occupations, but also to tell what many of them thought about the while. If Joyce did not attempt to be honest in developing the technique which he has adopted in Ulysses, the result would be psychologically misleading and thus unfaithful to his chosen technique. Such an attitude would be artistically inexcusable.
Okay, so he is making the artistic merit argument, just not the way I expected him to make it.
Absolutely. And then he does go on to also argue the book is not obscene. He says, quote, that reading Ulysses in its entirety as a book must be read on such a test as this did not excite sexual impulses or lustful thoughts, but that its net effect on them was only that of a somewhat tragic and very powerful commentary on the inner lives of men and women. And this is really interesting because what he's saying is basically the Hicklin test is bad. You can't just read individual snippets that look horny in isolation. You have to consider the whole work, and by any reasonable standard, while there are horny bits of Ulysses, Ulysses as a whole is not obscene.
Okay, so that is a very different standard of artistic merit.
Absolutely. It's also worth noting the ruling is appealed to the Second Circuit Court. 2-1 ruling in favor of upholding the publication. We don't need to get into that, but basically exact same agreement, right? There's one judge who dissents. And I do want to note that Judge Martin Mannion, I want to read his dissent about why Ulysses is obscene, because I think it's interesting. But the majority verdict is very similar to the Woolsey argument. So Mannion says, the public is content with the standard of salability, the prigs with the standard of preciosity. The people need it and deserve a moral standard. It should be a point of honor with men of letters to maintain it. Masterpieces have never been produced by men given to obscenity or lustful thoughts. Men who have no master. Reverence for the good work is the foundation of literary character. A refusal to imitate obscenity or load a book with it is an author's professional chastity. Good work in literature has its permanent mark. It is, like all good work, noble and lasting. It requires a human aim to cheer, console, purify, or ennoble the life of people. Without this aim, literature has never sent an arrow close to the mark. It is by good work only that men of letters can justify their right to a place in the world.
Oh, okay. So this is another installment of a very fascinating debate over the purpose of art that is going on all over the world at this time and continues for many decades thereafter. And his point in the debate is art must have some kind of morally edifying purpose. So if it doesn't have a morally edifying purpose, it's not really art. Am I correctly summarizing that?
Yes, if it is obscene, it is immediately not art, right? Every great artist, right? He says masterpieces have never been produced by men given to obscenity, which is, of course, fucking absurd, right? We've already talked about Geoffrey Chaucer. The Canterbury Tales is one of the classics of English literature. Shakespeare is extremely horny. Like, that's obviously stupid. And, you know, you're allowed to have your own opinion, but if that's your opinion, you should get a better opinion.
Fascinating. Okay, so, all right, it is now legal to publish Ulysses. Congratulations.
It is legal.
I will continue to exercise my right to not buy Ulysses.
Absolutely. So that's the end of the story. I am told, though God help me, I'm not checking, that every Random House edition of Ulysses published to this very day includes the John Woolsey opinion from the second trial as part of the text.
Honestly, yeah, that's a pretty good fuck you. I would continue putting that in every single one if I had the choice.
In terms of American case law, the second case, which is called the United States versus one book called Ulysses, is also important because it establishes the Hicklin standard is not good for defining obscenity. Some of the later cases, if you go back and listen to our episode on Lenny Bruce, we talk about this, will end up banning the Hicklin test outright as a test for obscenity. But this is the first kind of opening of an attack on the Hicklin standard for obscenity and a more permissive reading of what obscenity is. The New York Society for the Suppression of Vice has disbanded after Sumner retires in 1950. It is gone. The Comstock laws are still federally on the books, though provisions of them have been ruled unconstitutional, both at the state and national level. And of course, as Demetria noted, particularly after the Dobbs v. Jackson ruling, the question is now whether the parts about abortion applies to abortifacients that are mailed today. The Supreme Court has heard arguments on this, and I expect there'll be a decision sometime this year. So Tony Comstock is still fucking us despite being dead for over 100 years.
I gotta say, I'm a little concerned about the current makeup of the Supreme Court debating this particular wrinkle of the law.
And that's why, I mean, we're admitting to our political views on this, right?
That horse left the barn quite a few years ago.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. And that's why, if you're an American, go fucking vote. Go vote for Democrats. If you don't not vote, certainly don't vote for Republicans, but vote for Democrats. These people are fucking crazy.
I should get over some of my personal frustrations with how the conversation is going enough to do some research into the history specifically of the parts of the law that are being discussed today, because I really think people need to know, have the full history on that one.
But anyway, this is kind of why I think this is an interesting case, because it brings together all these questions around free speech and obscenity and what we as a society choose to sanction or not sanction. as you can tell, if you've listened to this podcast literally ever before, and I think this is probably true of Demetria too, take a pretty permissive view of that. That part of living in a free society is exercising the responsibility to be thoughtful in what you consume. That is only your job and no one else's, which doesn't mean you have to read things you don't want to. To be clear, I will never read Ulysses. I literally would rather read almost anything else. But you have the right to do it if you want to. No one should be able to stop you if you hate yourself that much.
Yeah, my own personal standards of morality and my own lines of disgust, I would say, are somewhat idiosyncratic, and it's probably a good thing for humanity as a whole that my personal lines of what I find to have artistic merit or something of interest artistically are not the law of the land.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I guess where the ongoing conversation is, but I think it's pretty clear that, like, the question of good taste is just inherently, like, it's arbitrary, right? Like, if you're trying to make arguments about what is or isn't obscene or on what is in good taste, that's always fundamentally down to individual opinion. And so therefore, not really a good basis for law. That's why I'm personally, when it comes to questions around, like, what is protected speech or not, in favor of doing your best to draw what are pretty, like, objective lines that certain things you can say or produce are just not allowed under any circumstances. And sure, that limits expression to an extent, but it's a clear line that we can all kind of refer to and understand, at least more so than just it's good taste.
Well, I think we should probably do some hate speech cases, because I feel like that is one of the boundaries that we explored certain kinds of non-protected speech in section 230, but I think hate speech is that's another boundary that I'd say we feel quite strongly about, that is worth exploring.
That's why I want to do the Skokie Nazi March, actually.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting one. Yeah, anyway, that brings me to all I have to say about James Joyce and his novel Ulysses, which I hope to never, ever talk about ever again. Any final thoughts?
I'm so glad that we got this opportunity to learn about corrupting the youth in a novel new way.
And just remember, folks, when in doubt, go back to that classic line from Finnegan's Wake. The dusk roast has chosed out goatswin's hedges, two lips have pressed together o' them by sweet rush. Townland of twined lights, the white thorn and the red thorn have fairy-gayed the May valleys of Knockmaroon? Fucking what?
Look, when you take a medieval lit class, you're just gonna get the good stuff, like a fox shitting on holy relics and throwing them at the king, like the classics.
And with that said, if any of our listeners have any holy relics they would like us to throw at monarchs, where can they find us?
You can find us at facingbackward.com.
We also have a Patreon. You can join the network. We also have a Patreon you could support at Facing... Oh my god, Ulysses broke my brain. Keep all of this in.
All right, you want me to read that for you?
I got it. You can also find... You can also support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward if you want to enable me to destroy my mind even more with modernist literature.
And thank you very much to folks who have joined the Patreon at the shout-out tier. I hope you know that your money went to a great cause, which is forcing Isaac to read Ulysses. You are Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCullough, Kieran Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, an anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sy, Gil, Leslie Ikuda, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Reese, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonasia podcast, Jennifer Pianzo, James, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Who Forever Remains a Schmuck, And everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked.
Until next time, folks, modernist literature, not even once.